In the 1960s, one of Elizabeth's attractions for overseas and interstate companies was the prospect of backwards and forwards linkages within Elizabeth's local economy. In particular, the subcontracting relationships between GMH and WRE, with the smaller engineering, metalworking and components firms, which fed them tools, machine parts and plastics. But such relationships and linkages are always subject to conflict, attempts to control and monopolize supply arrangements, and the tendency for large companies to pit smaller suppliers against each other to drive down prices, or supply or labor problems at one plant adversely impacting others. In an expanding economy, especially one with a healthy dose of state intervention and subsidization, such as Elizabeth had in the beginning, such competition between companies could usually be accommodated. But how firms might attempt to use the new town's landscape differently, and might come into conflict in their competitive attempts for advantage, was something the planners had never really considered. In addition, the new town was also an arena for other kinds of investment, most notably in retail trade. The promise of a large population and new housing was enough to secure a flurry of applications from large and small retailers when expressions of interest were invited. The Trust gave great thought to the town's retail structure. Small shopping centres in each suburb provided a convenient and accessible facility for residents, with each shop leased as a small business. The town centre, however, was based on mixed ownership, with the Trust maintaining freehold on some sites, but selling the land outright to others, including the large retailers. Not unlike the hierarchical relationship between rental and home ownership within each individual suburb, based on their proximity near or far from the industrial areas, the relationship between smaller neighbourhood and town centre shopping was based on the idea of planning for a hierarchy of shopping needs. Trades represented in the neighbourhood shopping centres were to cater for the housewife's day-to-day needs, but would not be sufficiently comprehensive enough to make it unnecessary for her to visit the town centre. One of the main principles in the town centre's design was to provide a variety of trades which had been purposefully excluded from the neighbourhood shopping centres, which were all owned by the Housing Trust, to give the housewife further reasons for going into the town centre. Fortunately for the Trust, the ability of their male engineers, surveyors and architects to shunt women around the landscape would ensure that retailers large and small could make a fair return from Elizabeth. But the major retailers, like the major industrial concerns, maintained an active interest in the progress of the new town and in the preservation of their particular powers and advantages. John Martin's, which snapped up the largest department store site in the town centre, sought to seek assurances about the rate of town building, the rate of house selling, and most importantly, the extent of competition, such as assurances they would remain the largest retailer in the town centre, with a maximum distance geographically to the nearest department store competition within the centre. And the Trust would find itself once again subject to expectations and demands for guarantees, which it did not really have the power to meet. A large retailer's Elizabeth was of growing population and growing consumption needs based on consumer convenience. The Trust managed a sort of compromise with its control of neighbourhood shopping, but again was led to introduce a potentially competing interest into the landscape. The issue was not so much active disagreement over the uses of Elizabeth, even if that did arise occasionally, but the fact that the Trust, industrial firms and retailers were all expressing and pursuing different interests in the landscape by creating their own Elizabeths, with their own ideas about how the residents of Elizabeth should act and behave within the context of their competing versions of the new town. Large industry wanted cheap housing for its workers, with itself as the effective, if not physical, core of the town's development. Smaller businesses wanted cheap rents, cheap services, and access to skilled labour. Major retailers wanted a city of well-waged, mobile consumers focused on the town centre. Neighbourhood retailers favoured a walking city of locals selling to locals, and the Trust wanted a productive, profitable, and harmonious community. Meanwhile, the pawns oblivious to this struggle for control over their time and resources, Elizabeth's original residents, simply wanted work, a home, and a safe place to start again with their families, free from the recent hardships endured by so many, following the uncertainties of life post-World War II. In a growing, and at the time booming economy, these different Elizabeths could occupy the same landscape, without coming into serious or protracted conflict, if only because those who had the most to lose from large company dominance, the small factory owners and retailers, had little hope of asserting their versions of the city. But how long conflict remained under the surface depended on how long the prosperity that kept it there would continue. In the end, the most serious problem would be one that Elizabeth's town planners had hoped their expert designs would help the city avoid, that of destabilizing economic and social change. In 1962, with interest in relocation and development amongst overseas and interstate companies at an all-time high, rapid growth at the GMH plant, and full employment in the town, the Trust could quite rightly be happy with their version of Elizabeth. For adult men at least, Elizabeth offered ample job opportunities. In the metal trades, there were also plentiful apprenticeship opportunities for boys. In 1960, 69% of male household heads who rented in Elizabeth worked locally, a significant achievement for a town barely 5 years old. A 1962 Town Planning Committee report confidently predicted jobs for 60,000 people in the Elizabeth-Salisbury industrial area by 1991, more than enough for a population they estimated to reach 150,000. So in one sense, Trust officials had done a tremendous job. As they travelled around Britain, Europe and North America, they had tried to pick winners and had sometimes succeeded, as was the case with Texas Instruments. Securing the GMH plant realistically seemed to guarantee the city's prosperity and to compensate for the odd failure or uncooperative landowner. Hindsight makes these decisions and compromises seem much worse than they possibly could have at the time. Trust officials probably knew the risks, but in the hard world of unstable investments and other states and governments competing for a few mobile companies, they had to make hard choices. Few people in the 1950s could have seen the coming troubles of the motor trade, let alone the downfall of the industrial era as it made way for the dawn of the technological age. More importantly than that, perhaps, is that by building factories and luring in companies, the Trust did give Elizabeth jobs, however temporary many would turn out to be. With jobs, Elizabeth could be a city for the future. Not the original future planners may have envisioned, perhaps, but a future all the same. Within a few years of its founding then, Elizabeth had changed. From the planned city of happy, balanced social groups, another Elizabeth had emerged, an industrial city, which ultimately rested on a very limited, non-local loyalty, and in the midst of prosperity, the two could coexist. Having allowed employers and industry more weight in the new town, the planners accepted the need for flexibility and common sense in an inevitable tug-of-war. But that tug-of-war was meant to be about details, a factory design here, an encumbrance there, maybe the odd dispute over a boundary or a decision on timing. With the larger details in place, the public authority could withdraw, their job done, while private capital, if nudged in the right direction, would not do anything to actually sabotage the plan. Effectively, if Elizabeth could become a place where industry could thrive, then the industrialists would have no need to abandon the town or undermine the planner's prerogatives. But in 1982, only 11 of the first 21 factories would still be there, while some firms had never really carried through with their development plans at all. Others had succumbed to interstate or international management decisions, or to corporate takeovers or disinvestment. The larger companies had generally survived, though often by cutting their workforces, while WRE was being renamed and rationalised. But the smaller firms, often enticed into Elizabeth to provide some much needed diversity into the local economy, had been rather less stable. Different companies had taken over some disused buildings, while other sites had been left to go derelict. Encumbering the land guarded against unsightly development or prolonged land speculation, but it could not guarantee a continuing presence in Elizabeth, because investments in a particular place are investments in its profitability and its productivity, not that place's long-term security. The companies which invested in Elizabeth had their own agendas and issues: competition for markets and influence, subcontracting and supply relationships, the quality of Elizabeth in terms of sales, labour turnover and labour relations. Their loyalty had to be to their Elizabeth, the Elizabeth of the profit margin and the bottom line. Following the boom years of the 60s and 70s, Elizabeth entered the 80s as recession gripped the country. As the car industry began its decline, it would see many of Elizabeth's light industries close down or relocate. Unemployment became a major issue for the once, if all but briefly, thriving northern suburbs, and was followed closely by a complete restructuring of the role of the South Australian Housing Trust itself. Changing policies in state and federal government towards public housing saw trust homes no longer being built and offered to new immigrant workers coming into the new town to fill factory jobs, but rather the existing properties would now become welfare housing. As factories began to close, many local youths and workers packed up and moved away to find better employment prospects elsewhere, while their vacated homes became occupied by residents beset with many of the social issues that come to plague such welfare housing estates. No longer the city of industry or of tomorrow, Elizabeth would fast become a name associated with social decline, high unemployment, crime, drugs and violence. Meanwhile, in the late 80s, the issue of council amalgamations began to surface. In the early 90s, the state government enacted the Voluntary Amalgamation Act for local government, and after several years of voluntary negotiations, the state government enacted a finite date for these amalgamations to take place. Elizabeth, Manapara, Gawler, Salisbury, Tea Tree Gully and Malala were required to enter into discussions to discover areas of interest for redrawing council boundaries. In the end, however, almost all recommendations put forward were ignored by the state government, requiring local government councils to amalgamate with their existing boundaries. This would result in Manapara City Council and Elizabeth City Council amalgamating in 1997 to become Playford, a name the founder of Elizabeth, Premier Thomas Playford, had himself resolutely opposed when names for Elizabeth were still being considered back in 1955. It would seem those responsible for the renaming of the area were either oblivious to their own town's history or simply ignored and disrespected Playford's wishes altogether. Just 47 years after its naming and 33 years after winning its independence from the council district of Salisbury to become a city in its own right, Elizabeth ceased to exist as its own independent council body, and the city of tomorrow fell. Beginning in the early 80s, continuing throughout the 90s and into the early 2000s, many of the original design features of Elizabeth planned by Henry Smith and his team of architects, surveyors and planners either fell into disuse, were demolished, or sold to private interests and repurposed. In 1983, the very first building ever erected in the town centre, Hotel Elizabeth, built in 1957, was demolished. A few years later, the Elizabeth skating rink, built in 1959, would also disappear. And in the early 2000s, the Octagon, once unveiled to great fanfare and host to some of Australia's most iconic bands, was demolished as well. Meanwhile, as cultural expectations evolved, it became commonplace for women to drive and work, rendering local shopping centres within walking distance less and less relevant, and these centres began to struggle. By the end of the 90s, as more small businesses went out of business, these centres began to fall into disuse and disrepair. Many would be sold to private interests, with little to no loyalty to the local communities these centres had once served. Maintenance on these buildings would lapse as they fell into decay and their car parks filled with potholes. In some parts, Elizabeth's suburbs would begin to resemble ghettos. Meanwhile, the land which once was home to Windsor Green at the Elizabeth City Centre, opened by Queen Elizabeth herself back in 1963, was sold to private interests, flattened, and turned into a car park. Other areas planned and developed as open space for the community were also sold off. No longer the Garden City, and having lost many of its original buildings and features, by the mid-2000s, the physical landscape of Elizabeth would be virtually unrecognisable in some areas to what it had looked like just 15 years prior, as all the precautions Henry Smith and his team had implemented in an attempt to make sure Elizabeth retained its unique character and physical heritage for future generations, were undermined and destroyed by local council committees, with the final hammer falling in 2013 when General Motors announced they would be ceasing all car manufacturing operations in Australia by 2017, forcing the closure of the Elizabeth plant and Elizabeth's major economic lifeline that year. What would happen to Elizabeth? What would make this long boom landscape look so badly out of date just 30 years after its creation was not the fault of its planners, for the cyclical restructuring and abandonment which would lead to Elizabeth's rapid rise and fall was the very restructuring and abandonment cycle in which the Trust had tried so very hard to intervene. Nor, of course, could members of the Trust themselves have foreseen the downfall of their own position as South Australia's major housing authority and champion of the working class. The Trust's Elizabeth was endangered and eventually undermined, not by poor planning or perhaps even poor timing, but by the eventual stripping away of its own powers and their naive hope that the hard edges of industrial competition and economic change could be solved, not simply delayed, by flexibility and common sense. The Trust had assumed responsibility for producing a city, but it had never expected, nor had it wanted, to exert any untoward power over essentially private decisions like industrial location. In this sense, Trust officials drew the same unfortunate lessons from economic prosperity as developers in other long boom economies. The naive hope that expert planners could build and guarantee economic prosperity in the short and the long term by servicing and subsidizing capital so it would stay in one place. Elizabeth was a quintessential long boom landscape, and that left it savagely exposed as that long boom eventually wound down and petered out by the end of the 1970s. The Trust planners, in their courageous and laudable attempt to build a town which brought people and jobs together, gave Elizabeth's people about 20 years of relative prosperity. Yet they also gave Elizabeth a specific and finite industrial future, with little or no control over labour or investment, and industries which achieved profitable growth, mostly through de-skilling, standardisation, and relatively low rates of innovation. The dependence on multinational firms, meanwhile, would significantly narrow the subsequent ability of the Trust, let alone Elizabeth's people, to determine their own future. And Elizabeth, like other long boom landscapes of the mid-20th century, would find itself haunted by the timing and the nature of its own creation.
By the road with an ache in my head, in the wrong side of town, left you sleeping alone in your bed. I guess I did let you down. In a wake-up state and out too late, trying to start over new. What I wanted to be never came to me. I've lost my way to you. I remember the words that you said when I pledged you my time. You would never get out of my head. You would always be mine. In a wake-up state and out too late, trying to start over new. What I wanted to be never came to me. I've lost my way to you.
It is only about 5 years since, with the permission of Her Majesty the Queen, I was able to name our new town Elizabeth. And since that time, large factories have been established. A very large city indeed has grown up, population of some 25,000 people. A very pleasant place to live in has been established. I believe that the people of Elizabeth are very happy people indeed.
By the road with an ache in my head, in the wrong side of town, left you sleeping alone in your bed. Guess I did let you down.